I'm so busy during the day. My
Right.
days, I'm busier now than I've been in many years. All right.
Well, good.
Well, no, it's not good, but it is what it is.
All right. So if we experience technical difficulties, what do you want me doing or not doing? All right. So if we
really can't
if we experience technical difficulties, what do you want me doing or not doing?
Live.
All right. So if we
really can't
if we experience technical difficulties, what do you want me doing or not doing?
Live.
All right. So if we
really can't,
if we experience technical difficulties,
okay, that's fine.
you know, that was not working. That was not working. I was hearing my own voice say the same thing over and over and over again.
I shut that down so that I know what
Okay.
happened there. All right, so we're streaming right now, both on YouTube and on Facebook, and on Twitter and on all kinds of places. Okay, but we're gonna go live officially now. All right, here we go.
The radical, fundamental principles of freedom, rational self-interest, and individual rights. This is the Yaron Brooks Show.
All right, welcome everybody to the Yaron Brooks Show, and I'm excited about today's show. I've got my good friend Brad Thompson, who is I don't know what the technical, I don't have your bio in front of me, but he's the CEO of the Clemson Institute for Capitalism, a professor of political science at Clemson University, author of many, many important books, one of which we're going to be talking about today. And importantly, my lead author, the lead author on a book we wrote together, it seems like in a previous lifetime at this point, on the, what we were hoping was the death of the neoconservatives. And to some extent, the death has happened. So I think Trumpism might have killed them for a while, but maybe that's a whole topic of conversation for us sometime, because that would be fun actually to revisit that. But today we're talking about, I got all the wrong windows open here. Let me just get back to, there we go. Today we're talking about Brad's latest book, which is a book on, really the way I think about it is it's the book on the Declaration of Independence, but its title is America's Revolutionary Mind. And I want to ask you about that in a minute, about the title. So yeah, let's start with that actually. So first, how you doing, Brad? I'm going on and on.
I'm doing fine. Your audience probably doesn't know we've had some technical difficulties making this happen, but you're in Puerto Rico, I'm in Clemson, South Carolina, and I think we're going to make this work.
Okay, let's see if there's any way for me to increase your volume. Trying to think. I don't know if we've got people online who could tell me what they think of the, you know. So what do you think of Brad's volume? Was it okay? See if anybody will comment. Help us out here. I'm trying to think if you have a way to increase your volume. Probably not. You're doing this through your phone. Is your phone volume maxed?
Let's see.
Because if you can.
It was not, but it is now.
Okay. Okay, it's going to be muffled a little bit, guys, but we're going to have to live with it because the internet connection wasn't good enough. So we're doing the actual audio by phone, and the video you're getting. Hopefully, it doesn't freeze up too much, but it was freezing up earlier. There it is. It's freezing up now, I think. Okay, so yeah, so Brad is in South Carolina under. Well, he's not under house arrest because in South Carolina, it is South Carolina after all. I'm under house arrest. Basically, curfew went into effect 4 minutes ago. So I am under curfew. I have no choice but to be at home. Otherwise, the police will fine me $5,000 or 6 months in jail. But that is because I'm in kind of Latin America. I'm in Puerto Rico, and Brad is in the good old United States and South Carolina. So, Brad, what do you mean by America's mind? That is, what is What does it mean to say America's revolutionary mind, and to assign a mind, in a sense, to America?
Yeah, so I got the idea for the title from a famous letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to Henry Lee in 1825, just before he died, in which he described the Declaration of Independence and its purpose as an expression of the American mind. And I think that's right. I think the Declaration is an expression of the American mind. It sums up the fundamental core moral and political principles on which this country was founded. But you'll note that I did not title the book The American Mind. It's America's revolutionary mind. So I was trying to be more intentional and focus on the ideas of the American Revolution per se. So, I mean, because if it were a book on the American mind, then it would have to be a book that takes up all kinds of issues about which I was not interested. It would have to take up issues and questions with regard to culture, American views on all kinds of issues, on marriage, on religion, on food, you name it. I wanted to limit the focus of the book to essentially both the causes and meaning of the American Revolution. So that's the America's revolutionary mind part of the title. Now, the second part of the title, after the colon, is a moral history of the American Revolution and the declaration that defined it. So first, let's parse American Revolution and Declaration. So initially, when I began to write the book, the idea was to write a book just on the Declaration of Independence. That was the goal. The idea was to write a relatively short book on the moral political philosophy of the Declaration. But very quickly, maybe a month into the writing of the book, I read another famous letter, this time from John Adams to Thomas Jefferson, in which Adams described the American Revolution not as the war, but rather as a revolution in the minds of the American people. And that revolution, he said, took place in the 15 years before shots were fired at Lexington and Concord in 1775. So that was the tripwire, the intellectual tripwire for me, when I realized that there was something much bigger, much deeper than what historians had previously told us about the American Revolution. Right? It was a revolution in the minds of the American people, and that revolution was a moral revolution. And Adams equates that moral revolution with the Americans' understanding of the doctrine of individual rights. Now, let me add one other quotation that I read at almost the same time that I think really sums up what Adams is saying. And that was that was something I read in a letter from Tom Paine to the Abbé Mably, in which Tom Paine said of the American Revolution that we see with new eyes, hear with new ears, and think new thoughts, right? So the idea is that there was a revolution of ideas. And Paine likewise, in addition to Adams, says that this moral revolution was directly connected to the Americans' understanding of the nature of rights. So that was the moment when the book went from being something about just the Declaration of Independence to really being a book about the entire revolutionary period. And so what I do is I use the Declaration of Independence as a kind of ideological roadmap by which to understand the revolution as a whole. So the book, let me mention that what I do is I take the Declaration's 4 self-evident truths, which can be summed up in one word each: equality, rights, consent, and revolution. And I devote two chapters to each of the self-evident truths. And then what I do is I provide a kind of intellectual history going back to the late 17th century, usually beginning with John Locke, and then trace how colonial Americans understood and transformed the ideas of the Declaration: equality, rights, consent, and revolution. And then but most of the book, though, is focused on the 1760s and 1770s during the so-called years of the imperial crisis. So it's a kind of comprehensive intellectual history of the revolution as a whole.
So Tom reminds us, I didn't realize this, I don't know if you did, that today's Patriots Day. So yeah, I didn't know there was a Patriots Day, and here it is, it's today. And really, it's amazingly fitting because, you know, if you think about where we are today politically, and I don't want to get too much into this, but really, you know, we've got political parties that are basically both reverted to tribalism, both explicitly and certainly implicitly for decades now have rejected the very founding principles of this country. We're in the middle of this unbelievable mess, which is this corona mess. But we're in this unbelievable political mess where both political parties have completely rejected these principles. So I can't think of a period in American history where this book is would be more important than right now, when these ideas have been lost. Ideas have been forgotten. Ideas have been forgotten even by the people who supposedly are trying to preserve them, conservatives, right? We've got now national conservatives and this kind of conservative and that kind of conservative. All I would sum up as anti-American conservatives because they've abandoned these ideas. And I think what Brad's book is doing is it's reminding us of these ideas and then digging deep into their origin and into their philosophical foundations to really help us lay a foundation for a new American revolution, because nothing short of a new American revolution, I've come to believe, is going to save us from the continued decline of this country. So let's delve into this because I think this stuff is really, really, really important. And so chapter 1, and I don't intend to go by chapter, but chapter 1 I think is really important because it lays kind of the intellectual foundations for everything else. Because the founding of America is kind of the crowning achievement of the Enlightenment, and you have to understand the Enlightenment to understand the founding and the Declaration. And what you do here is you lay down kind of the philosophical highlights and the essential characteristics of what the Enlightenment is. So tell us about what are the ideas that are at the heart and at the core of the Enlightenment that then, in a sense, made real, politically at least, because I think in other aspects they're made real earlier, but politically they're made real with the founding of America.
I'd say the key concept of the Enlightenment is the idea of the laws of nature and the rights of nature. So in other words, it's a rediscovery of nature. Speaking metaphorically, it's the rediscovery of the book of nature, which is now to be read through what 17th century philosophers called right reason. So it's both metaphysical and epistemological. The rediscovery of really both of the idea of nature, that nature is governed by certain causal laws that can be discovered and understood by human reason. And the three principal philosophers, I'd say, of the 17th century English Enlightenment were Bacon, Newton, and Locke. Bacon's his Novum Organum, which established a kind of intellectual or inductive mode of reasoning for reading and interpreting the book of nature. Newton's Principia Mathematica, which laid out the scientific laws of nature. And then two books by John Locke. The first was his Essay Concerning Human Understanding, which laid out a kind of empirical, inductive mode of reasoning. It said that reason is efficacious. Reason can understand relations of cause and effect, not just in nature, but also in human nature and in human action. And then along with the Essay Concerning Human Understanding, I would add the most famous book of the American Revolution, which was Locke's Second Treatise of Government, which established the idea of rights, that the purpose of government was the protection of rights, and it established kind of a limited form of government, which had at its heart the idea of individual self-ownership and self-governance, right? So Locke's great contribution, intellectual contribution to the revolution, I would say, is the rediscovery of the individual who is self-owning and self-governing, self-reliant, and is the master of his own life and of his future. But narrowing it down, I would say that the single most important thing that comes out of the Enlightenment for colonial America is the idea that the so-called laws of nature can actually be applied not just to nature out there, not just to planetary motion, but it can also be applied to the human condition, to human life, to human nature. And so you get primarily, I would say, beginning with Locke and his Ethic Concerning Human Understanding, an attempt to establish a demonstrative science of ethics, which he said should be as certain as mathematics. So it's taking, in other words, the methodology, the modes of reasoning that Newton used and applied to discovering the scientific laws of nature, to trying to discover certain moral laws and rights of nature. And I'd say that's the single most important contribution of the Enlightenment to the American Revolution, which then, as it's transported to America beginning in the 1730s and 1740s, Bacon, Newton, and Locke are being taught in America's universities for the first time. And take the case of John Adams, for instance. When Adams was an undergraduate at Harvard College, that's where he was first introduced to these great thinkers. And you can see Adams in his diary as a 20-year-old trying himself to apply Newton's methodology to discovering moral laws of nature. And he does it in three ways. First is extrospection. You look out into the world and you observe human nature, human action, and human interaction. And from that, you try to discover the underlying causes of certain forms of human action. And then from that, you can induce, Adams argued, as a 20-year-old, you can induce certain moral principles that will guide man towards a flourishing kind of life. And then from there, then it's a very short step to applying that methodology and the idea of a demonstrative science of ethics to the idea of rights. And that really is the first division between American colonials and British imperial officials in 1765 with the passage of the Stamp Act.
Yeah. So it's interesting. I mean, 3 of the 4 books you mentioned are really books in epistemology, right? And right. I mean, the way I always put it is the great achievement in the Enlightenment, not me. I mean, Ayn Rand and others have put it, is in a sense, the rediscovery of the efficacy of reason, and the application of reason to discovery the laws of nature and the laws of man, and then its application to morality, as incomplete as maybe they applied it, but they were on the right path, that it was in the right direction that they were trying to do it. So how do you get from there, you've got this idea of reason and you've got applying reason to morality? How do you get from there to the Declaration?
All right, so that's a long story.
That's a big question.
About 4.
But make it short.
Big question.
Short version.
Yeah, it's a big question. I have about 400 pages.
I know.
On that question. Yeah. So what I would say is the crucial moment in the coming of the American Revolution was 1765, when the British Parliament passed the so-called Stamp Act, which for the first time in colonial history imposed the tax on the Americans without any kind of representation, hence the famous slogan, "No taxation without representation." But this was a crucial turning point. Let me just put this in context, because you have to understand that for the previous 40 years or so, the British policy toward the American colonies was what they called salutary neglect. It was a kind of laissez-faire policy, a hands-off policy. And during those years, from approximately 1720, let's say, to the early 1760s, the Americans were basically left alone to govern themselves without any British interference at all. But then in 1756, Britain engages in the so-called French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, against France, which they won. And in 1763, with the Treaty of Paris, it's as though Great Britain woke up and remembered that they had these colonies. And they tried to reassert both political and economic control over their colonies. And the laws that were passed during the 1760s, the Sugar Act, Stamp Act, Declaratory, and Townshend Acts, were, you might say, it was an attempt by British imperial officials to superimpose the British deep state on American political life. So they shipped over hundreds, if not thousands, of tax collectors and administrators, and most importantly, they sent the British Navy and the British Army. So now all of a sudden, in 1764, 1765, the Americans look around them and they see all kinds, they see an expanded British state in the colonies, and then all of a sudden they're passing these laws. So I would say that, as I mentioned, the crucial moment was 1765 with the passage of the Stamp Act, which caused the Americans to reconsider not just their relationship with Great Britain, but the two most core principles that tied the colonies together with the mother country. And that was first, their understanding of rights, and secondly, their understanding of the Constitution. So let's start with the Constitution. Up until 1765, virtually all colonial Americans were fans of the British Constitution. They called it repeatedly the greatest constitution in the history of the world. But they realized now with the passage of the Stamp Act that there was one major problem with the British Constitution, which of course, there is no, right? So somewhere here, I've got my I'll show your audience, I've got my handy pocket Constitution with me, right? So I can pull this Constitution out of my breast or back pocket. And if Britain passes the Stamp Act, I can turn to the relevant passage in my Constitution and say, here's why the Stamp Act is a violation of the Constitution.
Yep.
But the problem, of course, is that they couldn't do that because there was no British Constitution as a written document. The British Constitution at the time was simply an assemblage, a collection of common and statutory laws and customs, and the form of government of the British government at any moment in time, which had always been evolving. So in other words, the British Constitution was always evolving. In other words, there was no there. And so with regard to the Stamp Act, British imperial officials argued that the Stamp Act was legal and therefore unconstitutional. It was legal. Yeah, it was legal and therefore constitutional. The Americans, by contrast, argued that the Stamp Act was unjust and therefore unconstitutional. Right. So that then that raises the question: why was the Stamp Act, from the American perspective, unjust? Well, it was unjust because it violated their rights. And this takes us to the next major moral concept that's really at the heart and soul of the American Revolution, and that's the idea of rights. So colonial Americans, up until 1765, were advocates of the so-called rights of Englishmen. Right? All Englishmen were proponents of the so-called rights of Englishmen. And England was, after all, at that time, the freest nation in the history of the world, right? Yep. And they gloried in their rights as Englishmen. But then they came to understand that there's a problem with that notion of the rights of Englishmen. The rights of Englishmen is a doctrine which says there are rights of a particular people at a particular place at a particular time. And those rights are always changing and evolving. And in the same way that the Americans would come to look for the idea or develop the idea of a written constitution as fundamental law, they also came to ground that. They wanted to ground their constitution on an idea of rights that would be permanent and unmovable, right? And that foundation, of course, was nature. So they were looking for rights that are grounded in the nature of man, rights that would be absolute, certain, permanent, and universal. And that was the critical moment, in my view, during the imperial crisis, when the Americans developed this and really filled out this new idea of what at the time they called natural rights, the idea that there are rights of nature or rights of human nature.
So let's I want to get into what they meant by rights and how they define rights, but let's kind of follow your outline a little bit. And I want to, there's always this question in my mind, this idea of self-evident truths, right? When you read it, you go, particularly in the world we live in today, none of this is self-evident, right? I mean, nobody gets it. Nobody gets it, particularly now. What did they mean by self-evident? And what was the context for them to talk about self-evident truths in the context of the Declaration?
Right. So I developed this idea in a chapter devoted to the 7 words that open the second sentence of the Declaration, which are, we hold these truths to be self-evident, which I think are the most important, if not the most beautiful words in the American lexicon. So, but it's also the most complex chapter of the entire book philosophically, and it was complex because at the time there was a very philosophically technical understanding or definition of what self-evident meant. And a self-evident truth was a truth where the proposition, it was a proposition whose subject and predicate necessarily related to one another without contradiction. It has to be perceptually self-evident. So examples would be up is not down, black is not white, in is not out, right? Something that's immediately perceptually obvious, self-evident to you. But here's the problem. If you think about it in the context of the Declaration of Independence, that doesn't quite hold, right? So the Declaration, after the opening clause, we hold these truths to be self-evident, then lays out 4 truths which are said to be self-evident, right? That all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among which other rights, the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And then the 4th truth, which, let me just, for the sake of your audience, I haven't quite memorized it. It says that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Mm-hmm. Well, obviously, that 4th self-evident truth and the 3rd self-evident truth are not self-evident.
Well,
they're not self-evident.
But even the first one is not. Given slavery, it certainly is not self-evident.
Well, it could be potentially self-evident if understood philosophically, right? If you just take the idea all men are created equal, right? You can interpret that in such a way that it kind of sort of comes close to being a self-evident truth. The second is much more is much further away from the strict technical definition of self-evidency, and the 3rd and 4th clearly are not self-evident. So the question is this. I mean, the question that I really spent a lot of time thinking very hard about is, well, what did the founders mean by self-evident? Well, it's also important to understand, and most scholars of the Declaration of Independence forget and don't, everybody focuses on self-evident. nobody until the chapter in my book on self-evident truths has focused on the idea of truth.
Yeah.
Right? What did they mean? Which I think is the much more important concept.
Sure.
What did they mean? What did they mean by truth? And it's important, particularly in the context of the world in which we live today, because it is said, as you know, that we live in a post-truth society.
Yep.
Right? The founding generation had a completely different understanding of what truth is. Truth denotes a relationship between an idea in the mind and objective reality, and that meant that truth they believed in the possibility of truth that was objective, absolute, certain, permanent, and universal. That's the first thing to say, which means then that the principles that they are establishing in the Declaration of Independence are not principles that would have been true only for 1776, but not in 1876 or in 1776 or in 21st century America.
Yep.
They believed that their truths were true, period. Right? All right. Now, we hold these truths to be self-evident. I mean, if you just parse the words of the sentence, this is a fascinating problem. Well, who is the we? Right? Is it Thomas Jefferson and the other four committees, the other four committee members who drafted the Declaration, including John Adams and Benjamin Franklin? Did it mean the Continental Congress, which signed the Declaration? Did it mean all of the American people? Right? So then you ask the question, well, how could these truths be self-evident to all people?
Mm-hmm.
And then what does it mean to hold these truths? Sorry, so I don't want to go too far into the weeds on this, but here's my bottom line position, is that the American revolutionaries expanded the original understanding and definition of what self-evidency was. And what they argued was you begin with a foundational, even self-evident truth, from which then you can carry forward with that core idea deductively principles which naturally issue from the core fundamental truth. And so the four truths all work together logically, right? From equality to the revolution truth. They are all, the second, third, and fourth truths, follow logically from the first one. And I think what Jefferson was saying in the Declaration, when he said, we hold these truths to be self-evident. I mean, I think those truths, self-evident truths, were self-evident to Thomas Jefferson and John Adams before they became self-evident to ordinary, everyday Americans. Mm-hmm. But once those truths had been discovered and stated as they are in the Declaration of Independence, then they can become self-evident to those who then read those truths.
Yeah, I mean, it requires them a lot of thinking, right? I mean, it's not. Self-evident is it's tricky. It's tricky, but
it is.
So
it is.
I have two of these self-evident truths. I mean, the two foundational ones and the important ones. Before we get there, though, I want to cover this point. So, I mean, particularly conservatives, but people generally, and even on the chat here, I've got people saying, but the founders were, we've talked about reason and logic and deriving things from nature and everything. Where does the founders' religiosity play into, in terms of their thinking and in terms of how much of their religion is in the Declaration, if any?
Okay, so let's start with this fact. Approximately 98% of all Americans in 1776 were practicing Christians.
Yep.
Right? That's a fact. But that fact does not directly bear on the arguments that were used by American revolutionaries during their conflict with British imperial officials. So if you read the major pamphlets, and not just the major pamphlets, the minor pamphlets and newspaper articles of ordinary everyday Americans between 1765 and 1776, what you see are Americans making political and constitutional arguments against the sugar stamp, declaratory Townsend T, coercive acts. And then to the extent that they ground their arguments in moral principles, all of them, 100% of them, argued that they had certain rights and laws of nature. Every single American revolutionary argues from the position of the laws and rights of nature. So in other words, nature was the standard for 100% of all American revolutionaries. Now, it is also the fact that a relatively large percentage of those revolutionaries also believe that the source of those rights was the creator, was God, right? But there's a sense in which that doesn't really matter. All American revolutionaries grounded it in nature, and the ultimate source of nature's laws is a secondary at best. In fact, it's really an irrelevant concern. It was an irrelevant concern for American revolutionaries in their battle with British imperial officials. So the arguments that they are making, which were new arguments and were much, much more reflective of the Enlightenment and even of the secular Enlightenment than they were of the Bible, right? So for those people who think that America had a Christian founding, I'd like you to show me the documents. In other words, I want the evidence, right? I've provided a 400 plus, almost a 500-page book with hundreds and hundreds, thousands of quotations and footnotes, demonstrating, I think, conclusively that the primary intellectual influences on American revolutionaries were those of the Enlightenment and of John Locke in particular. Now, I would challenge anybody who argues that it was a Christian founding to show me where, in their arguments against British imperial officials, they were making arguments from the New Testament against the Stamp Act, right? Now, they did. I mean, there were pastors, there were ministers and priests who gave sermons during the period of the American Revolution, and that those sermons, were full of biblical allusions and biblical arguments. But what's interesting is that even these pastors their ultimate arguments were Lockean arguments, and explicitly Lockean arguments, quoting Locke chapter and verse.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, somebody's asking, a number of people asking, how many of the founders do you think were deists? Believed in a kind of a God that set things in motion, basically left man alone. Yeah,
that's a hard question because it depends what you mean by, founding fathers, right? So if you're talking about the most elite of America's founding fathers, the Adamses, Jeffersons, Madisons, Hamiltons, et cetera, I'd say, it was a relatively higher percentage. I would say to one degree or another. I mean, they all partook of a certain amount of deism. I'd say Jefferson more than most, or some people like Ethan Allen, Tom Paine, I think were much more in the deist camp. But even somebody like John Adams, who attended church every Sunday, Adams comes, I have to say, pretty darn close himself to being a deist.
Wow. Good. So let's jump into the Declaration itself, and after, of course, the passage about the sentence about self-evident truths, we get to all men are created equal. And equality these days means something very different than equality did to the founders. So what did they mean by equality? I mean, obviously not the equality in the Rawlsian sense, not equality in the kind of the economic sense today. So what was the sense in which all men were created equal for the founders?
Right. So, so let's begin with what they did not mean, obviously, which was they did not believe in any kind of egalitarianism. They did not believe in radical sameness, which is what 21st century egalitarians believe. They did not have any concept of group rights. They didn't think, that any group had some sort of collective rights. They believed in individual rights. And what they meant by equality is that all men are, it's what John Locke in the second treatise referred to as species equality. And species equality says that all men are of the same species, and they all have, by definition, certain common fundamental characteristics or qualities, namely reason and free will. Mm-hmm. And by virtue of having reason and free will, they are equal. But the founders did not mean a kind of quantitative sameness or quantitative equality. They understood as well as anybody, right, that there were real differences of intellect, of physical ability, of virtue, of talent. They recognized what Jefferson referred to as the natural aristocracy. So on the one hand, all individuals have the same fundamental qualities of being a human, reason and free will, but reason, for instance, will differ in great ways. But they, in the end, what they fundamentally meant by equality, I mean, it can be summed up, I think, in this way. No man is by nature the ruler or master of another, and no man is by nature the slave of another, which is to say, then, that all men by nature have or should have equal rights. So for the founders, equality essentially is synonymous with rights. Yep. Or sometimes they just called it freedom.
Yeah,
so
equality.
So I think that's how they understood the idea of equality.
And they didn't have a concept, which again conservatives have kind of picked up, which is their attempt to be a little bit egalitarian, but not too much, which is equality of opportunity. They had no. Did they have any? I mean, they wouldn't have a conception of equality of opportunity. Right?
No.
Yeah.
No. I mean, equality of opportunity means that basically everybody has to be put, almost always through the coercive force of the state, mm-hmm. on the starting line at the same place. That's what equality of opportunity means, is that everybody starts at the same place. But they recognize, I mean, there's a kind of egalitarianism built into the idea of equal opportunity. No, they understood and recognized, of course, that, and John Adams probably understood this better than anyone, right? You walk into a hospital foundling, right, and you see in front of you 10 babies, right? You understand that the child of put it in contemporary terms, Bill Gates, is going to have probably greater advantages in his life than the children of Brad Thompson. But that's life.
Well, in some respects they do, and in other respects, your children might have greater opportunities than Bill Gates. Well, intellectually, for example, you might be providing your children with better, ammunition, if you will, than less money, more intellectual ammunition. Bill Gates, more money. I mean, we're all different, and we'll all have opportunity. Is just another outcome. It's a cop out of conservatives to try to straddle the fence and not commit to being anti-equality of outcome. So Gail asks, so did the founders recognize reason as man's necessary weapon of survival? Did they make the link between reason and survival? Like Graham?
Yeah, they did. Yes. So I mean, this is harder to tease out in their writings because the revolution was a moral revolution, to be sure, and in certain ways it was an intellectual revolution. But the Americans were at best, the best amongst them, the Jeffersons, Adamses, Washingtons, Madisons, et cetera, they were statesmen, they were politicians, they were fighting a real war. So they weren't philosophers, but they were extraordinary philosophic statesmen. But in their writings, they absolutely do understand that and argue. It's, they don't write Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology. That is true.
Sure.
But they do, in passing references, maybe a paragraph or two, they do identify and recognize reason as man's means of survival.
Yep. So here's one more question. Could any of the founders have been atheists, but were afraid to say so publicly?
There were atheists at the time. I would say they were mostly people, in fact, they were almost entirely people that we have never heard of. So just to give you a concrete example, when John Adams was a young man, just after he graduated from Harvard College, he taught in a one-room schoolhouse for a group of 8-year-olds in Worcester, Massachusetts, which was at the time sort of on the western edge of civilization. And at that time, Adams fell in with a kind of radical group of men that he met with at night, and they would sit around and drink ale and talk theology and philosophy. And Adams reports that there were individuals that he socialized with who in fact were atheists. But what percentage of Americans were atheists at that time, or as I prefer to say, without religion? I'd say, it was probably, no more than 2% of the population.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. It's not much larger number today. It's a pretty small number even
Right.
in the 21st century. So they held this view of equality. How did they rationalize slavery in this context? And how did they rationalize also, I don't know, how did they rationalize women in the context? Did they really think that men and women were that different? Did they write about that? Did they take kind of Aristotle's view of women?
No, I wouldn't say that. In fact, I would not say that at all. So they don't, there isn't much at all in the writings of 18th century Americans, particularly during the Revolutionary period, which is my focus of study.
Sure.
They're not talking about the status or rights of women, although there is a famous exchange between John Adams and his wife Abigail, where his wife reminds him, John, do not forget the women. Yeah. And she was an advocate of the extension of the principle of individual rights to women, who at the time would have been denied certain civil rights, such as voting, and other legal rights as well. But they just don't talk about it. Now, the issue of slavery is something that they did write about and fretted about, and it's an extremely complex subject. So the obvious question, that you begin with is, how could individuals who declare all men are created equal and that they're endowed with certain unalienable rights hold other human beings as chattel slaves? Right? Were America's founding fathers simply hypocrites? And I think the answer to that question is absolutely not, for the most part. There were some, I think, who were hypocrites, but it's a very complex issue. So let me lay down some markers before I really begin to answer the question. I think maybe the single most important thing to say about America's revolutionary founders on the subject of slavery is that they established the intellectual foundation for the eventual abolition of slavery. There would be no abolition of slavery in the United States had there not been a revolution, had there not been a Declaration of Independence. In fact, I would say the Declaration is the single greatest impetus for the abolition of slavery in the United States.
Well, not just in the
period
U.S.
between 18
Not in the U.S. My guess is that it was responsible for a large extent for bolstering the case of abolitionists all over the world, particularly in Great Britain.
Oh, it was, without question. But in the case of the movement for abolition in the United States, the earliest abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison explicitly were quoting the Declaration of Independence as their primary motivation and inspiration. All right, so that's the single most important thing to say. All right, so this idea that's been promoted in the last 10 months by the New York Times in their 1619 project that America was founded not in 1776, but rather in 1619 with the arrival of the first chattel slaves in America, it's an example of fake news doing fake history. I mean, built into their argument is that America was founded in sin. And therefore, because it was founded in sin, America is by definition, therefore, immoral. And all of American history, they argue, is driven by slavery, and everything that is good in American life, not to mention everything that is bad, but everything that is good, particularly as it relates to the wealth generated by capitalism, is tainted by slavery, which is false. I mean, the 1619 Project is a joke. It's a disgrace, and it's wrong.
Absolutely.
Basically, from beginning to end. All right. So,
and they've had to retract much of it, if not all of it, right? Because they've come under such criticism.
Well, I mean, they've come under intense criticism.
Yeah, it's unbelievable.
They've basically been, just to put it very crudely, disemboweled intellectually.
Yep.
I mean, their argument has been completely deconstructed by some of America's greatest historians. But here's the problem. It doesn't matter whether America's best historians have taken apart their argument. The fact of the matter is that they are working with the Pulitzer Foundation and already have the 1619 Project into hundreds and hundreds of American school districts. Wow. And by next year, it'll be in half of America's schools, which means American children will be taught to hate their country. And I would submit that a country that hates itself cannot stand.
Yep.
So
I think they're already being taught that. This will just further entrench that position, but it's already in our schools, has been for probably 2 or 3 decades at least, the anti-American attitude in the curriculum in our schools, in history, social sciences. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So let me now get to the actual question that was asked.
Yep.
All right. So the first thing to say is that let's examine the founding generation as a whole. And as it turns out, there was an entire spectrum of views amongst the founding fathers on the question of slavery. So at one end of the spectrum, there were those founding fathers like John Adams, who thought slavery was immoral and never owned slaves. And then there was a group of American revolutionaries like Ben Franklin and John Jay, who much earlier in their lives, living in the North, either in Philadelphia or in New York City, owned what we would call, or what was called at the time, a house slave, somebody who was essentially a servant in their house, but still nonetheless was owned as a human being. But Franklin and Jay eventually saw the error of their ways and freed their slaves, and then on top of that became the leaders of the anti-slavery movement. They created some of the first anti-slavery movements in the United States. And then going down the spectrum, you get people like George Washington, who understood their entire lives that slavery was wrong and that it was immoral. And then upon their deaths, they freed their slaves, or upon the death of their wife, they had their slaves freed.
Yep.
And then you move to the really hard cases. The case, let's say, of Thomas Jefferson, who owned slaves his entire life and did not free his slaves upon his death. All right, this is the hard one. So here's what we know about Jefferson on the question of slavery. Jefferson said clearly and repeatedly that slavery is immoral, it's wrong, and it should be abolished. And he did it for the exact right reasons. He says clearly that slavery is a violation of the rights of these African slaves. And because he did believe that when he wrote, all men are created equal, he meant it. He meant that all men are created equal in their rights. Now, it's also the case and Jefferson also understood that slavery as an institution was an immoral institution that corrupted masters as well. Jefferson hated and wrote about this in his notes on the state of Virginia, wrote about the corrupting effect of slavery on the owners or masters as well. All right, so there's that. Next, Jefferson, certainly during the Revolutionary period, in his primary revolutionary essay, A Summary View of the Rights of British North America, he argues against slavery. There was a passage in the Declaration of Independence that he wrote against the slave trade, which was subsequently taken out by members from the South in the Continental Congress. Jefferson was also the author of a document that would eventually become what was called the Northwest Ordinance, which did in fact free slaves, or it did not permit the extension of slavery into the Northwest Territory, right, which is the territory between the western slope of the Appalachian Mountains and heading toward the Mississippi. So, right. So, Jefferson did a lot to advance the cause of anti-slavery. And then, of course, there's the Declaration, which was the moral basis of virtually all of the state constitutions. And between 1776 and 1804, every single state in the North eventually, over time, abolished slavery. And they did it on the principles of the Declaration of Independence.
Absolutely.
And by 1810, there were over 100,000 freed slaves in the United States. So clearly those principles had some effect. The principles of the Declaration had a large effect on creating the anti-slavery movement in the United States. All right, now let's zero in on the really hard part. In the end, despite knowing that slavery was wrong and immoral, Jefferson did not free his slaves. There's no getting around that. And that was immoral. That was immoral. And what I would argue is that part of the reason why I don't think Jefferson freed his slaves was in part because he was too addicted to a profligate lifestyle.
Yep.
The guy was constantly in debt, and at the end of his life, he was basically had declared bankruptcy right at the end of his life, and in fact had to get a bit of a bailout from the state of Virginia. But there's a deeper reason. that Jefferson talks about, and I think this is real. And it's what I call the post-emancipation problem. And this is the single greatest reason why slavery was not abolished sooner than it was. All right, so what's the post-emancipation problem? It's the problem of, well, okay, sure, slavery is wrong, it's immoral, and we should end it as quickly as we possibly can. But then what? Right? You've got a now freed population who has never been educated, has not been taught to read or write, and if you free them, Jefferson wrote once that with regard to slavery, we have the wolf by the ears and we don't know whether to hold on or let go. The fear was that if you free the slaves en masse, all at one moment in time, there would be a race war. And Jefferson says that in a race war, justice is on the side of the freed slaves. But of course, no person living in the white South is going to want to be involved in a race war. They also thought, and I think with some good reason, that slavery would die a natural death. And at the time, up until the invention of the cotton gin, it was almost certainly the case that slavery was starting to die out in the South. The international slave trade was ended in 1808. And there was already an anti-slavery movement. Slaves were being freed in the United States. But of course, the invention of the cotton gin changed everything. And so so then the question is, all right, if we can't free the slaves and integrate them into our society, what do we do with the slaves? Well, do we create a colony in the Trans-Appalachian West? Do we create a colony in Africa? But then there's the complicated question of, well, do you compensate slave owners? Many slave owners would not free their slaves unless they were compensated.
Yeah.
Right. But who in the North is going to want to compensate an immoral and evil institution? So it was. Let's just say it was complex. And
this complexity leads to 600,000 men dying, a violent death. I mean, yeah, they would have freed 100,000. Maybe they would have been a race war. I doubt 600,000 men would have died in one of the most brutal wars we have ever seen, and at least certainly in this continent. But yeah, you can't get around the fact that freeing the slaves, given the South's attitude, most people in the South's attitude towards slavery, was never going to be peaceful and easy. And so, yeah, there's no positive outcome to compromises like that.
Right. So let me just conclude by saying this.
Yeah.
Virtually all American revolutionaries understood that slavery was what they called a necessary evil. Right? The emphasis has to be on evil, right? So every slave owner, so if you read the private correspondence,
is that true of the Southern representatives of South Carolina or whatever who signed the Declaration?
Yeah. I mean, well, let me give you the cases that I know best. So take Patrick Henry of Virginia, who was a slave owner. And Thomas Jefferson. If you read their private correspondence on slavery, particularly Patrick Henry, he was tortured by this.
Yeah.
George Washington was tortured by it. Yeah. Tortured in the sense that they knew it was wrong and immoral and evil. They wanted to get rid of slavery. They just didn't know how to do it. That was the problem. Yeah. They didn't know how to do it.
Yeah.
And they didn't know how to do it in a way that would not lead to a racial civil war. And they didn't know how to do it in a way that would be just to their slaves. But of course, and then in the end, Yaron, none of them could have imagined the Civil War, right? Because at that time, they honestly believed that slavery was going to die a natural death.
Yeah.
That's how they saw the future of slavery. They saw it dying out within a couple of generations. But of course, the irony, the tragedy of history is that rather than dying out, it became much stronger. There were no, as far as I can tell, there were no American revolutionaries who believed that slavery was a, quote, positive good.
So,
Right?
yeah. So I want to get to the South's attitude towards slavery, because I think that's really interesting because you have this chapter, as America lost its American's mind, the American's mind, because, and it's really interesting. I didn't realize the extent to which the South, I mean, I should have realized that it was philosophically corrupted post-revolution, the post-constitution, in the early 19th century, and how much German philosophy had a role there to play. I mean, that was really enlightening to see that. So we don't have, I mean, it's already, I don't know if you're limited in time, but we're already gone over an hour. So I want to talk about individual rights, and then maybe we should skip to that chapter and talk about kind of what happened in the 19th century and how that leads to where we are today. And then we can find a way to end on a positive note. But let's, so of course, the heart of the Declaration and the heart of the founding and the heart of everything that is America is this idea of individual rights and the idea of building a political system around the concept of individual rights and the protection of individual rights. And of course, it's another concept that in the 21st century, we have to explain, because it's been corrupted by generations now and generations, really since the progressives, and so since the late 19th century, the concept of rights has been perverted and distorted. So what did the founders mean by rights? What are, as they refer to them in the Declaration, what are rights?
So as I mentioned earlier, right, their view on rights evolved between 1765 and 1776. They began with the position that they were the inheritors of the rights of Englishmen, but they very quickly transitioned to the idea that there are so-called rights of nature. And what I discovered in my research, and then what I lay out in the book, is that the American revolutionaries actually had a fairly sophisticated view of rights, much more sophisticated, for instance, than John Locke. So everybody thinks that John Locke is the author of the idea of natural rights. But if you read the Second Treatise of Government, I'm not even sure he uses the term natural rights even once in the Second Treatise. And if he does, it's just once or twice. He sort of infers the idea, but American revolutionaries latch onto this idea that there are rights of nature. And the deepest American thinkers at this time in the 1760s and 1770s took it right down to the question of human nature, right? So they understood that human nature is one uniform, and that there ought to be a relationship, or that there should be a relationship between what man is and how he ought to act. And so the question is, what is man? So as I mentioned earlier, they viewed man as having two fundamental characteristics or qualities, namely reason and free will. And that to be fully human, you had to have the freedom to exercise your reason and your free will. You have to have the freedom to think, to choose, and to act. And then there's a sense in which, maybe even at a deeper level, they view the individual as the primary unit of moral and political value, right? So rights applied not to groups, as we've already talked about, but rather to individuals. And they said repeatedly that man is self-owning and self-governing. And the fact that he is self-owning means that no other individual has any claim on his life at all. So, they, in the end, they don't have Ayn Rand's exact formulation, her exact definition of what rights are, But I have to tell you, Yaron, they come quite close to having Ayn Rand's definition of rights, right? They understood that rights they understood that they're moral concepts and that they have something to do with the freedom of action, and they have something to do with the freedom of action in a social context. Yep. So, there's a kind of pistache, when you take all of their writings and you put them together, you can certainly build from that a view of individual rights, which comes very close to Ayn Rand's definition of rights. Rights recognize, as they understood them, rights recognize that it is necessary and right, that men should be free to choose and take those actions that are necessary to support his or her life, right? That it's necessary and right that man should exercise his rational faculty. It's right and necessary to act in order to acquire, keep, use, trade your property. That it's necessary and right to benefit or to be the beneficiary of one's choices and actions. And so if you read the chapter, I believe it is the first of the two chapters on rights, is where I give the fullest explication of how the founders understood the very idea of rights. So, a typical problem I have when I teach the Declaration, I ask my students, what is a right? And their immediate response would be, one kid says it's life, another kid says it's liberty, another kid says it's property, another says it's the pursuit of happiness. No, that is not what a right is. Those are instances of rights, right? What I need is the definition. And American revolutionaries do give a definition with the necessary qualities and characteristics that issue from rights, right? That they are unalienable or absolute, permanent, universal, right? They are necessary conditions. So I analogize it in the book to, there's a twofold character to rights. They serve, as understood by American revolutionaries, they serve as both a fence, protecting us from other individuals of the government who would initiate force against us. But it's also, secondly, a license. It's a license to act in the context of a civil society.
Absolutely, yeah. And in many respects, that license to act, that recognition of the freedom to act, is what's so important about rights. The fence is necessary to make that possible, but the action is what is the motivation. So I have two super chat questions. I'm not sure what this one means. See if you know. How come the founders equivocated on the right to keep one's own property, including money? So I assume the fact that they allowed for taxes, or they didn't take it all the way. They didn't have a fully consistent perspective of the role of government, as obviously Rand did.
Yeah, I mean, they were not anarchists, that's for sure.
Yep.
Good. But they I think are literally the founders of the idea of limited constitutional self-government, right? And the fact that they had certain inconsistencies and imperfections in their ideas as they were in the middle of fighting a war should not surprise us.
Yep. So here's a hypothetical question. If the founders had been alive during the Industrial Revolution, been around for Darwin, do you think they would have come closer to objectivism? Could they have been who they were if they came 70 years later? I mean, the intellectual environment was so different already by then.
Yeah, it was. The intellectual universe had dramatically changed in the 50 years after the American Revolution. So after the American Revolution, you get the introduction of German philosophy into England and then into the United States. So, this may be a segue, Yaron, to
Sure.
the question that you started to ask a few minutes ago. So I think one of the really interesting, maybe even extraordinary things that I discovered in writing what is the epilogue to the book titled, Has America Lost Its American Mind? And by the way, I should give a shout out to Sydney Michelle Austin Taylor Thompson, my wife, who came up with that fabulous title for the epilogue. And what I discovered is that the first great critics of the principles of the Declaration of Independence were Southern slave owners. I had always assumed that the first great critics of the principles of the Declaration were the early progressives.
Yeah.
John Dewey, Woodrow Wilson, Herbert Crowley, et cetera, et cetera. But no, it was Southern slaveholders. And what's really interesting is that they all came under the sway of German historicist philosophy. So it turns out the first recorded American to attend Hegel's lectures in Berlin in the early 1830s was a young Southerner who returned to the United States with Hegel's ideas in tow. And from that point forward, Hegel's ideas come to dominate Southern intellectual life. And and I will say that there was a true, vibrant Southern intellectual life between say 1830 or so and the end of the Civil War. In fact, I would say many of the best intellectuals, most impressive intellectuals, although almost always completely wrong on everything, were Southerners. And their critique of the Declaration begins with a critique of the idea of truth, right? So they were historicists. They believe that there is no such thing as an absolute, eternal, universal truth. Truth is relative to place and time. Truth evolves. And they believe that Southern society was moving, as Hegel had argued, toward an end point. And they believed that the Southern plantation was the highest point of world civilization.
Yeah.
And then, of course, by rejecting truth, once you take out the foundation, then everything else follows. So they rejected all four principles of the Declaration, or all four truths, namely equality, rights, consent, and revolution. And take the idea of rights, right? So their position was that the concept of rights as presented in the Declaration of Independence might have been true in 1776, but it was not true in 1845. Why? Because rights evolve, and we in the South have evolved a different kind of culture. And so they rejected the idea of rights. But here's what's really, and with the idea of rights, they then rejected the idea of limited government and absolutely the doctrine of laissez-faire capitalism.
Yep.
And one of the things that I uncover in the book is that these Southern slaveholding intellectuals were pre-Marxian Marxists. So their critique of Northern capitalism was virtually identical to Marx's interpretation of capitalism, his critique of capitalism in Das Kapital, except that these American Southerners are writing almost a decade before Marx is writing, which is interesting. But here's the kicker. Not only did they reject freedom and capitalism, some of them took their ideas to their logical conclusion, and they became advocates of communism explicitly. Mm-hmm. So George Fitzhugh, who was probably the greatest Southern intellectual, described the slave plantation as, quote, the beau ideal of communism.
Wow. And what's shocking is that even though they lose the war, they win the intellectual battle, because so much of those arguments that they made are modern. They're with us today, again, both on the right and on the left. There is no today concept of the absolutism of rights in our intellectual world. That it's all contextual, it's all tribal, it's all situational. So what happened? Where were the defenders of the Declaration? I mean, I know Lincoln obviously was the great defender of the Declaration in particular, but were there intellectual voices in the North or in the South or anywhere who understood the foundations of the Declaration and stood up to these people?
No.
No, that's a great tragedy of American history.
It is the great tragedy of American history. And in the post-Civil War period, two things happened. The founders' classical liberalism utterly collapsed, and there were no defenders of the founders' liberalism in the post-Civil War period. The only intellectual who comes close is a guy named William Graham Sumner, who was a professor at Yale, who wrote some truly wonderful essays in defense of limited government and laissez-faire capitalism. But he totally imbibed the German idea of historicism and the idea that rights evolve and cultures evolve over time. So on the one hand, the superstructure of his theory, namely the politics and economics, was then completely undercut by his denying the idea of individual rights. But then the second great thing that happened, and by great I just mean momentous thing that happened, was a kind of philosophic tsunami crashed onto American shores beginning in the 1870s, particularly in the North. And interestingly enough, it was the same ideas that had corrupted the South that were becoming dominant now in the North. That is to say, it was German philosophy. Kant, Hegel, Marx, Nietzsche are now the dominant intellectuals that are being read by Northern American intellectuals. The most important of whom I would say is John Dewey. And John Dewey, in my view, is the single greatest critic, philosophic critic of the founders' liberalism. And Dewey's ideas reign supreme in the United States. In a sense, you could say that 21st century liberalism, as they call it, progressive socialism, has not had a greater intellectual than John Dewey, right? So if you really want to understand the 20th century progressive socialist critique of the principles of the Declaration, I would say read John Dewey's book, Reconstruction in Philosophy. Now, let me say one last thing, Yaron, about this, and that is what is genuinely scary and worrisome, and I'm actually writing about this right now, is that there is a new right that is rising in America that I call either the dissident or the reactionary right. And what's fascinating is that this is the first generation ever of conservative intellectuals who are explicitly anti-American, by which I mean they are explicitly opposed to the principles of the American founding, right? Their position is that the Declaration of Independence leads to the Port Huron Statement. Their position is that George Washington necessarily leads to Boy George.
Yep.
Right. All of the corruption that they identify in modern America, they think the source of it is actually built into the DNA, the intellectual philosophic DNA of the principles of the Declaration of Independence. It's a straight line from the Declaration of Independence to all of the drag queen story hour.
The decadence and hedonism of the modern world. Yep.
Yeah, yeah. So they have become open and explicit critics
Yep.
of the Declaration of Independence, and in that way, they are much closer to the 1619 Project crowd
Yep.
and to the left, right? I mean, there was a time, right, when at least, despite all of the problems of the conservative intellectual movement, which are legion,
Yep.
you could say one thing about American conservatives. They believe that the principles of the founding were true and worth defending.
To the extent they understood them, yes. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
But
they
now
had a
there's
sense of they loved America and they loved the founding and they loved the founders. And this generation, I agree with you, rejects all of that. Rejects all of that. And the tragedy is that there weren't voices to defend, and that the conservative intellectual movement was such a weak voice. The left had John Dewey, the right had nothing. I mean, they had their tradition, they had a love of the founders, not really connected to anything intellectually real. We wrote about one group, the neoconservatives, but all of them, they were all empty in philosophical terms and their ability to defend. So I've got two last questions. One is, to what extent has Ayn Rand helped you understand the founding, helped you understand the Declaration, and shape your approach to this project? I mean, objectivism, not her personally, obviously.
Yeah. So let me begin answering that question by saying that there is a sense in which the single most important intellectual influence on my life before Ayn Rand was a book that I read when I was a child, 7 or 8 years old, called The How and Why Wonder Book of the American Revolution, which I talk about in the preface to my book. And that was the moment when I realized that I was an American born in the wrong country. And so I've had a lifelong love affair with the United States of America, and in particular, the revolution. And, with regard to Ayn Rand's influence on the way, for instance, that I approached this book, I mean, Ayn Rand allowed me to better understand the deepest philosophic principles of American revolutionaries in a way that I don't think I ever would have or could have without having read Ayn Rand, particularly, for instance, the concept of rights, because, for instance, most conservatives, for instance, believe in this idea of natural rights, but they somehow believe that these natural rights are literally inherent in us, as if we could see them, right, by putting somebody through an MRI or by cutting them open surgically, right? And so the idea, Ayn Rand's idea of rights as moral principles that have to be discovered, right? That have to be discovered, right? They're not floating in the air. They don't come down to us from on high. They're not inherent in us. They are principles, moral principles that have to be discovered. I would say that very particular idea, I learned from Ayn Rand, and then as I was doing the research of this book, it helped me to better understand their arguments and to see the direction in which they were moving. But on a more fundamental level, and this goes back, Yaron, to your very first question, which was about the title of the book.
Yep.
And I didn't finish my answer to the question, right? So the subtitle of the book is A Moral History of the American Revolution and the Declaration that defined it. So what is a moral history, right? There are all kinds of histories of the American Revolution. It's the most written about topic in American history. There are social, political, constitutional, economic, religious, diplomatic histories of the American Revolution, but there had never been a moral history of the American Revolution. And it was really from Ayn Rand that I learned, that in order to understand human action, which includes human action in the past, you have to understand that the individual is the primary unit of moral and political value, and that there is a relationship, which is not understood by modern historians. There is a relationship between man's ideas and his actions, right? So that's the thing that modern historians have completely disconnected, is ideas and actions, right? And never the twain shall meet. And it was from Ayn Rand, from her essay, Philosophy Who Needs It, and just her philosophy in general, that helped me to develop this new methodology. And that's what it is. The new moral history is a new methodology for studying the past. So really what I'm doing, in part, is taking Ayn Rand's philosophy and applying it to the study of human action in the past.
Mm-hmm. Great. All right. So let's end with this. So what now? What can somebody take from the book that will help them, will help us, change the world in which we live? Because clearly, we can all agree, and I don't want to go into it, but world's not heading in the right direction. It's heading fast in the wrong direction. How is this book going to help us change course?
Yeah. So I think one of the reasons why Ayn Rand's philosophy has not spread as far and as wide and as quickly as we would like it to is that the culture has become so intellectually and politically debased to the extent that it no longer believes or accepts the principles of the American founding, mm-hmm. right? And so there's a sense in which the reconstruction, one might say, of the American mind actually has to begin first with the reconstruction of America's revolutionary mind as the necessary prerequisite, intellectual prerequisite, from which Americans can then graduate on to the best and truest and most capacious defense of those principles, which is found in the writings of Ayn Rand. So this book, Yaron, it's two things. It's a work of history, so it's an attempt literally to reconstruct America's revolutionary mind. So in that sense, it is a scholarly book, scholarly history and political philosophy. But it's more than just that. Even though I don't wear it on my sleeve, I think it's also true to say that the book is not only an explication of those ideas, it is a defense of those ideas. Mm-hmm. And it's a defense of those ideas as true. And so what the book does is you could read America's Revolutionary Mind as the antidote to John Dewey's Reconstruction in Philosophy, because it lays out the core philosophic and political principles of the founders' classical liberalism in a way that it has never been laid out before, including by the founding fathers. Mm-hmm. And if we can bring enough Americans to return to the American founding, understand those principles, then that, I think, then is the necessary springboard for them to graduate onto the completion of the founders' philosophy in Ayn Rand.
Excellent. So for all of you listeners, I think this is, if you are with me in wanting a second American Revolution with me and Brad, and wanting to fight for such a revolution, and I think the day will come where we will have to fight for it. This is a important book for you all to be buying, reading, letting people know about, sharing, recommending. It's American Revolutionary Mind, a moral history of the American Revolution and the declaration that defined it. It's on Kindle and hardcover. I'm hoping it comes out on audio. More and more people are using audio these days. It's coming out. Good. Brad says
I just signed a contract.
excellent, excellent. I find myself more and more reading books that way, although I'm driving less, so I'm back to reading. It's this is a real deep examination of the most important political document, in my view, in human history, which is the Declaration. My view, more important than the Constitution, more important than anything that came before it. Certainly, it is the document that lays the foundation for 250 years of America, of what this country is. The better part of it, not the crap that comes with it. But so I encourage everybody to read it, to learn, and it's full of real reverence for the founders and the Enlightenment. And there's no great intellectual period, maybe with the exception of Greece, than really the Enlightenment and its representation in America of that period. So go buy the book, everybody. Do it now. I know some already have. I saw them on the chat saying that they loved the idea. I mean, they can't literally go out and buy the book because, of course, all the bookstores are shut down by our rights disrespecting government that puts itself in a position where it can shut down all businesses. But they can download it by Kindle. I mean, isn't it amazing to live in a 21st century where you can just sit at home and bam, there's the book on my Kindle. Any last thoughts, Brad? And it's getting late.
Yeah. So just to let your audience know, I am at work on a second volume on the American founding, the follow-up volume. It'll be titled America's Constitutional Mind, on the origin and history of the idea of a written constitution as fundamental law. So that'll be the follow-up volume, and I can tell your audience that it is now about 3/4 written.
Oh, wow.
And so I'm hoping to get that done maybe in the next 6 months. And there's a very real possibility that there will be a third volume, making it a trilogy. And the third volume, if it's written, will be titled America's Founding Mind, on how America's founding fathers created the greatest nation in the history of the world.
So kind of a summary of the first two books, or how do you view that one?
So, well, the second one, America's Constitutional Mind, actually begins in the 17th century with what I call the Puritan Constitution. And it traces the idea of constitutionalism through colonial America, up through the Revolution, and it probably is going to end in 1780 with the writing of the Massachusetts Constitution. So after all of the state revolutionary constitutions were written. And then the third volume, America's Founding Mind, then will be concerned with the intellectual sources on and the writing and then debates over the federal constitution of 1787.
Wow. That sounds amazing. Sounds amazing. All right. Thank you, Brad. Really appreciate you taking your some time on a Sunday, and in spite of all the technical problems doing this. So I'm glad it worked. Always good to see you. Always good to talk to you. And thank all of you for listening. Share this. Remember to share it, and to like it, and to support the show on yaronbookshow.com/support. And you can find out more about Brad. If you put in Google Brad Thompson, Clemson, you get a whole string of stuff about Brad. And of course, all his books on Amazon. You can find them all there. And why don't you say something short about the Lyceum? Because some of my listeners, not many of them, but some of them are in high school. And I think this could be really exciting. I mean, this project should inspire all of you. And I think the high school kids, you might consider showing up.
Sure. So let me first tell your audience that if they're interested in my work, they should go to my new website, cbradleythompson.com, all one word, cbradleythompson. And then on the Lyceum program. So as you mentioned at the beginning, I'm the executive director of the Clemson Institute for the Study of Capitalism at Clemson University. And we now have what I think is the most important academic program at the university level in the United States. It's called the Lyceum Scholars Program. It's a scholarship program. We give 10 scholarships per year to incoming freshmen, renewable over 4 years. And in exchange for the scholarship, the students are required to take 8 classes together as a cohort over their 4 years. We use a great books approach to studying the history of liberty, capitalism, the American founding, and the principles of moral character. And the classes include a course, for instance, called Wisdom of the Ancients, a course in ancient Greek and Roman moral thought. And the reading list is based on a reading list that John Adams gave to his 13-year-old son, John Quincy Adams, in the 1780s. We have a course on the political thought of the American founding, which I teach, a course called Political Theory of Capitalism, and a course called Wisdom of the Moderns, which is modern moral thought from Shakespeare to Adam Smith and Jane Austen, Dostoevsky, and ends with Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead. And what's really cool about this program, and I think what distinguishes it from every other program in the United States, is that we have something called the Socratic Tutor Program. So we assign to each one of our Lyceum scholars what we call a Socratic tutor, who is a faculty member associated with the program, who meets with his or her tutees every other week for about an hour, the purpose of which is twofold. First, to help our young people translate theory into practice. So if you're reading Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics in Wisdom of the Ancients, the question is, how does your typical 18-year-old 21st century American translate Aristotle into their lives here now today? And the second purpose, the major purpose, is to introduce our students to questions of moral character and their moral character in particular, because we believe there's a connection between moral character and a free society. You can't have a free society made up of moral reprobates. So in a nutshell, that's it. That's the program. And any high school students out there listening tonight, or any parents with high school age students, check us out. Just Google Clemson Institute for the Study of Capitalism and go to the Lyceum tab, or just Google Lyceum Scholars Program and you'll find it.
Great. Well, thank you, Brad. Thanks for sharing this evening with us. Thank you all for listening. Don't forget to like and share, and I will see you all on Tuesday. I'm doing a debate tomorrow with a socialist on Zoom. We'll release that video at some point, but I'll be on live next time on Tuesday. So thanks, Brad. See you guys. Bye.
Thank you, Yaron. Thanks to your audience.